Bar the main villain Yhwach himself, the Schutzstaffel are by far the greatest threat in the final arc of Bleach. The title itself is a literary travesty of a historical faction related to a real-life war. From that alone, Kubo clearly intended them to be prominent figures of a certain notoriety, or at the very least ingrain our impressions of them as ineffaceable, and for the most part he succeeds in immortalizing them in the context of the Thousand-Year Blood War. As Yhwach's elite guard, each of them approaches the status of deities, some more literally than others, so overbearingly formidable that Kubo had to conjure what could arguably be called contrivances to defeat them. The Schutzstaffel represent the pinnacle of Quincy evolution, the strongest of the Sternritter chosen to serve as Yhwach's personal protection squad. Each of their motifs is based on a different era of war. However, I should state that Kubo never designates any of the eras to a particular member, and he just puts it out there for us to figure it out. Obviously, for the likes of Gerard and Lille, it's glaringly obvious, and even though you can infer for the others, it's not quite as salient as the former two. Possessing the X-axis, Lille Barro. Possessing the miracle, Gerard Valkyrie. Possessing the compulsory, Pernida. Possessing the death-dealing, Askin Nakk. And finally an auxiliary entry, possessing the antithesis, Ishida Uryu. Lille Barro, the third gunslinger that Kyoraku faces in the series, is the leader of the Schutzstaffel. As the first Quincy to ever receive a shrift, he considers himself to be Yhwach's greatest masterpiece, an emissary of God closer to reaching divinity than any of his contemporaries. His motif is based on the modern era of war, quite evident in the sniper rifle he uses. He calls it the diagram, and technically it's his version of the Quincy bow, an item he can dismantle and reform in an instant. His personality is that of a stern zealot, in moments appearing to be quite measured and pragmatic in his appraisals. Like Kyoraku and in line with the era of war he represents, he has no fixation with playing by the rules because he believes there are no rules in war. As much as he seems like he's well versed in the art of war, he literally contravenes it all in his conceit, and to a degree you can't really knock him for his immodesty. The X-axis is a broken ability, or at least it would be if not for Nanao's Shinken Hakyoken. He's basically able to pierce through a target of his choosing and everything in between. More specifically, everything in his line of sight leading up to the specified target. It's very abstract. He doesn't fire projectiles, condensed reishi, or physical bullets. Once he aims and fires at a target, anything and everything in a straight line is penetrated without fail. It's a swift, indefensible form of attack that is invisible and hence nigh impossible to evade. At the same time, his body acquires an intangibility of sorts. Physical attacks simply phase through his body as if his presence was ethereal, and in this state he cannot be damaged by any sort of weapon. The X-axis is equivocally the perfect ineludible offensive shield, conferring invincibility in its defense and attack simultaneously. Quite unlike Bleach, which can only cater to one or the other at a time. But there's a caveat to using it. Only when his usually closed left eye is open is he able to utilize his shrift. In his hubris, he intentionally keeps it closed to give his opponents a semblance of a fair fight. And even though it's a million times more condescending, it's quite analogous to the Kenpachi's Reiyatsu ceiling eye patch in the sense that he goes to combat with a limiter. The difference being that while Zaraki does it to enjoy the thrill of an uphill battle, Lille does it because he believes nobody is worthy of experiencing the unbridled force of his beatific power. And in that regard, anybody who forces him to fight with his left eye open is a sacrilegious sinner, unholy and undeserving of mercy. As if that wasn't enough, his Volstandig transforms him into this seraphic being with all the wings and halo to boot. He's immune to all reishi and kido-based attacks, and the only way to harm him is by reflecting his own power back at him. He is quite literally what he claims to be, the closest thing to a god. Gerard Valkyrie is a gallant warrior, brave, imposing and rambunctious. A relic from an era-long past who lives for the fight. His motif is very patently based on the medieval era of war, and much like Lille, he's very pompous in respect to his own power. He very much resembles the gladiators of ancient Rome, a fearless champion who relishes battle and embraces his own mortality as easily as he draws breath. In fact, if you know anything about Zaraki, you'll find that they're very similar in that regard. Gerard revels in the grueling thrill of combat, a battle junkie defined by his valiant bullish conviction in the face of the slimmest of odds. He's a simple man, direct and lacking in strategy, but eager to challenge himself and overcome his limits. What he lacks in tactics, he makes up for in his sheer undaunted indomitability. The miracle, as the name suggests, is an inexplicable ability that grants him extraordinary power in the bleakest of moments. The more disadvantaged he is when he's facing what most would perceive as a hopeless situation, the greater it would qualify as a miracle to overcome it. He literally draws strength from being overwhelmed. An immortal who progressively reconstitutes himself into a stronger being with every bruise he suffers. He gets his head gorily skewered by countless tiny blades of Senbon Zakura, a miracle happens and suddenly he's back on his feet. He gets sliced in half, annoyingly asymmetrically by Zaraki, another miracle happens and his form is restored. He gets frozen into a giant popsicle and dismantled into pieces, and still he reforms from absolutely nothing. Each time he croaks, he comes back from the jaws of death like a phoenix, except bigger, stronger, and faster. An incorrigibly immovable soldier who would swing his sword for his god even in death. That is, until his god decides to make his death more permanent. However, while he claims to have been bestowed everything, his perpetually undying condition is not a consequence of Yhwach granting him a piece of his soul. He is one of only two Sternritter whose imbued shrift is nothing more than a letter of identification with barely anything to add to his already existing power. Because Gerard Valkyrie the Quincy is also bizarrely the beating heart of the Soul King, the god that holds the world in place. Pernida is an enigma, the left hand of the Soul King whose form is quite literally a hand. A freakish anomaly that stretches the fantastical bounds of the law of Bleach. Despite the obvious affiliation to Reyo, he's very unapologetic about his status as a Quincy. The second of the Sternritter whose powers are not predicated upon the shrift he was granted, but rather are immanent as a result of his connection and subsequent disconnection with the Soul King. His motif is based on the ancient era of war, and as I was looking into it, I found an interesting take by a creator called Animewad. I'll post the link in the description, but basically they theorize that the ancient era of war is in reference to the period when people would engage in biological warfare. In the 18th and 19th centuries especially, there were several instances where colonizers would intentionally spread disease to clear out the natives of the land. It came in many forms, whether it was contaminating their water reserves with waste material, or distributing clothes which had been exposed to infection, or even assaulting them with weapons dipped into the remains of decomposing bodies. And there's a direct nexus between this level of bioterrorism and Pernida's contagious shrift. The compulsory is a foul, distasteful ability, invasive in its nature and compellingly imperative in its methods. It requires him to extend his own nerves, manipulate them into permeating those of his target, and then hijacking the functions of his opponent's body, which he utilizes in the most gory, blood-curdling way. The invading nerves spread like an incurable infection until he establishes absolute, unfettered control of the body. Unless one has the mental fortitude of Zaraki or the technical acuity of Mayuri to sever the infected part, there's really no way to counter an ability which literally commandeers the control center of the human anatomy. It's an inexorable steamroller that seizes authority over bodily functions, and with each instant he colonizes an opponent's nerves, he steadily pilfers their abilities, movements, personalities, basically anything governed by the nervous system, evolving to achieve an almost homogeneous growth. Pernida himself starts off as a blank slate, speechless, indifferent, and mechanical. A capricious phenomenon that constantly adapts to gain sentience in the form of a mishmash of improvised character traits that he acquires from his victims. Progress, advancement, growth, adaptation. That is the quintessence of the left hand of the Soul King. There's a lot to say about Askin, but I probably don't have the leeway in this video structure to exhaust my opinion on him, so I'll try to keep it short. The most three-dimensional Sternritter whose appeal is not in a facile claim to godhood, but in his incredibly suave demeanor. He's an incurably flamboyant character who somehow manages to keep a low profile. And a lot of it has to do with his flippant disregard and disinterest in public validation. Despite possessing one of the most unstoppable shrifts, he'll happily play the fool if he has to. Unlike the rest of his quote-unquote godly comrades, he doesn't speak in absolute terms. Kubo crafted him to be very relatable, which I think is the reason why a lot of the exposition is told through his narration. He's savvy, fascinating, and certainly not short of eccentricities. Even his loyalty to Yhwach is a disingenuous mask to conceal his own twisted sense of adventure and morbid curiosity. His motif is based on the current era of war, a time when nuclear deterrents are prevalent throughout the world. Radiation is a major pervasive theme because living in this technologically developed society exposes us to it from all directions. And it ties in pretty well with Askin's death-dealing shrift in the sense that a bit is okay, like the radio waves we receive from phones and computers, but once you're exposed to a certain level, it could potentially be fatal. This is all a very dawdlish of a simplification, which may not exactly be bang on, but I'm hoping I've conveyed the general premise. In Askin's case, this is what he refers to as the lethal dose, the amount of any substance that will cause death without fail. Any substance, not just limited to radiation, but first he has to ingest it into his body to control it. Like the saying goes, the dose makes the poison, which basically means that too much of something is poisonous. So when he drinks his own blood against the Zero Squad, he's able to adjust the lethal dose of Nehemiah's blood. By reducing that lethal dose, he makes it so that the amount of blood in Nehemiah's body is in excess of the amount required to kill him. And when you look at it that way, the more blood Nehemiah has, the more poisonous it is to him. It's a two-pronged attack where if Nehemiah wants to survive, he has to let out the blood in his body until it falls beneath the lethal dose, but even if he manages that, he'll still be in mortal danger because the body can't operate without a certain amount of blood. For someone who can sometimes come off as comically ridiculous, it's honestly a pain in the ass ability to deal with. But that's not even the end of it. Once he experiences an attack of any kind, he can analyze it and instantly raise his own body's lethal dose to the attack and heal himself, meaning that specific attack, that specific Reiatsu won't be able to work on him anymore. The utility of his shrift is very aptly deserving of his status as a Schutzstaffel, the man who's constantly at death's door but for whom it just won't open. And then there's Uryu, who I'm honestly just gonna scheme over because he's basically an honorary member. Obviously, there's no era of war that he represents, and Yhwach just pigeonholes him into the group. He was technically one of the Schutzstaffel, and that's the only reason I'm bringing him up, but let's be real, he never really fit in with the rest of them. The antithesis, though, is definitely something I'd like to talk about, but I think I'm gonna reserve it for character analysis. So with that said, let's collate everything we've learned from the former four. All of them were defeated through some very unorthodox means. For Lille, a divine god-killing sword, for Gerard, the Auschweilen, and for Pernida, the accelerated and controlled growth that apparently a portion of Nemu's brain is capable of. I don't want to say it, but in the format in which they were presented to us, they come off as incredibly convenient aspools, especially for Lille and Pernida's deaths. Even for Askin, as much as it doesn't lead to his defeat, Yoruichi's cat form, which makes her Reiatsu and personality fickle, is nothing short of a deus ex machina, manufactured for the sole purpose of countering Askin or the other way around. And by the way, the guy lives on for a few seconds after his heart is literally ripped from his body and crushed into oblivion, so there's that. It feels like Kubo had a clear image of these endgame villains who are meant to push the Soul Society to its absolute limit, but he ran out of time to land the latter half of their individual fights, particularly in Askin and Gerard's battles. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Which of the Schutzstaffel are you most excited to see in the anime adaptation? Personally, I can't wait for the Pernida vs Mayuri battle, but if we're talking about individual moments, then it's definitely Askin for me. Anyway, thanks for watching, subscribe to the channel for some more videos, and until next time, stay safe. Peace.